So here in the second section, we are considering the story of the Roman Republic, and we're going to be talking about the rise of the Roman Republic as a major empire. And you need to understand something about the terminology from the outset here. Republic is what we're referring to as the type of government Rome employs at the time. They're still under the consul, tribune, senate, assembly idea here during the Roman Republic. But by territory, the wars that we're going to focus on in this lecture, they are building their territory. And by landmass, they certainly would be considered an empire during this time, by the general definition that we are using for empires. But they are a republic, governmentally. And eventually they're going to have emperors and politically actually become an empire, but not just yet. So let's talk about the wars between Rome and Carthage. All right, so you can see the city of Carthage down here on the map. Now, Carthage is actually a former Phoenician colony. The Carthaginians are actually Phoenicians, okay? And this colony has grown and grown and grown, become very formidable, and they control much of what used to be the Phoenician Empire and the Mediterranean. And so as Rome ascends, this group is naturally going to clash with them, and they're going to have problems. So you can see the Carthaginian Empire includes Corsica, Sardinia, right, part of Spain, all of North Africa here, basically, and even into Sicily, which we would consider part of Italy, right? And so the Carthaginians have a perfect natural barrier that has been built up. This is an aerial photo of modern Carthage. And you can see it's a very beautiful place. And then over here, this is an artist's reconstruction of what probably the ancient port would have looked like to a certain degree. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of guesswork because it's not a precise archaeology, but mostly from descriptions that they had, this sort of circular feature is like a perfect harbor. And the best harbors are protected by, natural formations, so the boats will be protected from the wind and the waves. And of course, they basically built it up so that it would protect the boats. They created this. And then in the middle here, you would have had a giant lighthouse, and then this very narrow channel to kind of get in. A great natural advantage to someone who wants to be kind of the rulers of the sea. And the Carthaginians and the Phoenicians, their ancestors, were really good seafaring people, right? And so that means that, this first battle of Carthage, the Romans are going to have a major disadvantage because the Carthaginians, let's just face it, they're flat out better sailors, and they're fighting this war mostly at sea, so the Romans have to catch up to the Carthaginians when it comes to naval tactics. Now, the Romans are a formidable fighting force on land. Let's not get that wrong. Basically, they match Carthage there. But they don't have anything initially when it comes to Carthaginians' navy. And the Romans then come up with this thing called the Corvus, or the Raven, and you can kind of see in the illustration down here of this. This is the Corvus, also known as the Raven. It basically kind of looks like a crane, this thing right here. And they would mount it on a ship, and you could turn it, and you could move it to where you needed to be. And so if, let's say they were attacking this ship over here, they would drop it, and you would release the tension, and then you'd have a spike that would be attached to it, and it would be super heavy, and you would just basically lower it and put it over the deck of an enemy ship, and then you would release the spike, and it would just drop through the bottom of the ship and sink their ships. Like, that's genius. Like, the Romans, they're so brutal and genius. And so, basically, even if it didn't sink the ship, now our two boats are attached. Like, you can't escape from me, and I've just turned a sea battle into a land battle. So now my superior soldiers are going to come onto your boat and stab you in the face. And it's pretty clever. It's a great example of Roman engineering and ingenuity. And I mean, these guys, if you're an engineer or you like engineering stuff, man, the Romans, they're your civilization to go check out. Because there's lots of videos on Roman engineering and stuff like that on YouTube. Like, if you go and look, I watched one the other day, like the top 10 ancient engineering feats of the Romans, and it was like an hour and a half, and I was just like, wow, these people were insane. They knew how to make water go uphill. I mean, it's just unbelievable. But, so this kind of helps them level the playing field. and change the way that the fight works. And eventually Rome will win that first Carthaginian War. And so that's going to bring us to the second Carthaginian War. And these are called, and by the way, if you ever see this on a quiz or a test, they're going to be called the Punic Wars, Punic, Punic Wars. That just means the wars between Rome and Carthage. They're called the Punic Wars. So we have the first Punic War, now we have the second Punic War. And we're talking about, Carthage, and make sure you understand that. So the second war really starts off because Roman minds, they want to break Carthage into basically three groups, right? And so after the first Punic War, there's a treaty between Carthage and Rome that stipulates that Carthage would continue to keep the region of Spain, which you can kind of see here. Carthage kind of would keep this as long as they maintained tribute that they owed Rome for losing the first war. So Rome says, hey, you can keep that stuff, but just send us tribute. Send us money, send us taxes. Just keep the cash flowing and you can keep the territory. But in 219, the Romans orchestrate a coup in the cities along the coast in Spain, which is right here. And they install a government hostile to Carthage. And the Romans are going to try and overthrow them using a full military invasion and install this government that's not loyal to Carthage because they want that as well. Because Spain has two really things that Rome wants. Spain was very rich in silver and in tin. And so Rome wants both of them. Well, obviously Carthage is like, hey, you said we could keep it. And they're going to want to defend their holdings. And so they send the most famous Carthaginian general ever, and maybe one of the greatest military tacticians ever, and I'd put him on par with like Alexander and Napoleon and like some of these people. And that guy's name was Hannibal. Okay, Hannibal. They sent him to march on the city in 218. He laid siege to it. He conquers it. Now, Hannibal is the son of a major general from the first Punic War. And so Hannibal has this in his blood. He's a great military leader, one of the foremost, like I said, ancient military generals. And you could put him, like I said, in terms of military acumen up there with Alexander. He uses very clever tactics. And Hannibal is a very serious threat to Rome. He is probably the closest that Rome comes to being defeated before they could even become an empire, because Hannibal, says, hey, we're not just going to take the city. Now, the Romans are kind of mad. They say, no, you should give it back to us. They go to war. Hannibal says, no, we're not going to take it, or we're not going to give it back to you. And the Romans are obviously wrong, but they don't care. And so Hannibal is going to march, and the war is on. So he decides the best strategy is actually, instead of just stopping at Spain, he thinks, I'm going to put an end to this once and for all. I'm going to take the fight to Rome. And that's what he does, actually. Incredibly effective. He invades northern Italy in 218. He crosses the mountain range called the Alps. And this is kind of the stuff of legends. I mean, it's actually history, but he leaves his brother in charge of the armies in Spain. He takes this route in blue here, all the way along the coast, through the Alps, which are up here. Very, very impressive feat. It's a massive undertaking, if you really think about it, because Hannibal actually brought war elephants. Yeah, war elephants. Gangster. And he marches them across the Alps. Okay? And it's incredibly aggressive, and he's bolstered by the people who, as he goes, the Romans at this point had conquered the Etruscans and the Latins and really started to set up their empire. People didn't like the Romans and what they were doing, so people are joining Hannibal. And so there's plenty of groups that don't like him. They see Carthage as a chance to take Rome down, so they join up. And he kind of shows himself as this great liberator, freeing the people of Spain from Roman control. And the army steadily grows until he's got about 50,000 infantry, about 10,000 cavalry. He hits the Alps, and that's, obviously you have a problem with the elephants and stuff because it's pretty tragic, Like this is an artist reconstruction. Like elephants are just falling off the mountains and stuff. It's awful. But either way, it's a hard time having those elephants cross the narrow mountain passes. But Hannibal is determined to get them through, and he found them very useful in terrorizing the Roman army because, if you're in a phalanx, you've basically just become a big line for an elephant to come up and stampede you. So, he's like, oh, the Romans aren't going to know what to do with this. This is going to be super effective. And it's a great advantage. And so a bunch of elephants in the battle are obviously going to be, pretty obviously a help. He reaches the mountain. He leaves his siege engines, and he tries to conquer cities and get supplies and drag those along. And there's a battle. The weather, it gets bad. There's very hostile tribes live in the mountains, so they kind of get harassed the whole time they're trying to cross the Alps. But anyway, 17 days later, his army, which started crossing the Alps with 50,000 men, is down to 26,000 men. He lost about half of his army trying to get across the Alps. But he's still pretty confident that he can win, and he goes ahead and heads into Italy, and the Romans, meanwhile, have no idea that this is even happening. They are completely taken off guard. And it's considered that, he's crazy for even attempting this, and for years, the Alps had basically been this great barrier that had protected the Romans. It's too dangerous, too cold, too windy, too rocky and treacherous to try and cross, and they didn't worry about it. So he pulls it off. It cost him greatly, but he does pull it off. When word reaches Rome that he's actually done this, they do something that is really smart. And they send a guy named Scipio, who's actually the father of a more famous Scipio that we'll talk about in a minute. And they meet at the Chiano River, where Rome is actually defeated by Hannibal. The Roman army is defeated by Hannibal, and Scipio is nearly killed, right? And you see here, this is kind of where it's all happening. And it's a win for Hannibal. He continues to defeat the Romans, and they need, at Trivia, they defeat the Romans there, and it becomes, they just whoop the Romans. And I'm kind of going out of my way to tell you this because people think Rome was this invincible juggernaut, and they're not invincible, actually. Literally, Hannibal almost whips them here. They're getting pretty convincingly beat on their home turf and being invaded. And Hannibal, with his incredible army and tactics, he's again presenting himself as a liberator. And he is the major enemy of Rome. And so they say, hey, here's our chance. Let's join up with Hannibal. And here we go. Now, you might think, okay, well, what's going to happen? What eventually, does he defeat the Romans? No, the Romans finally get smart eventually because Hannibal realizes that he probably doesn't have quite enough yet to get down to Rome and conquer the city itself. And so the Romans kind of have time to put something together. And they decide they're going to launch a new assault with the Roman army under the Roman general Quintus Fabius Maximus. And he employs a new tactic of wearing Hannibal down by keeping him constantly on the move and off balance. Fabius becomes known as basically the delayer to Romans, which is actually clever. He'd get close enough that Hannibal would try to attack him, and then he would retreat and run off into the countryside. And basically, Hannibal's army is just getting tired. It's very clever, and Hannibal keeps, getting into head-on confrontations, and Fabius is just trying to put it off until they can continue to get together. Now, as he's running away, he's actually pretty successful in wearing Hannibal down, and he actually outmaneuvers Hannibal to where Hannibal ends up in a trap. So the Carthaginians end up being pinned near Capua, which you can see here, Capua. They end up being trapped, and he's blocked by a river, and it seems that Hannibal either is going to have to fight his way out or surrender. And so then one night, as fate would have it, the Romans see this line of torches moving from the Carthaginian camp towards an area that had a fort and was held by a very strong garrison of their own. It seemed very clear to them that Hannibal was trying to break out of the trap. So Fabius, his generals tell him, hey, we got to go out there right now, attack them and crush them before they can get, to the garrison. And Fabius refuses. He believes that the garrison that was in place could easily prevent Hannibal from breaking out and that they would hold until morning. So when they wake up in the morning, they march and they say, hey, we're going to go battle, and what they find is cows that have torches tied to their horns, and they had sent these animals out, and the army had slipped away through a path that the Romans had left unattended. And so, in other words, Hannibal put his torches on the horns of cattle to make it look like in the night that they were going to go attack this fort, and then they sneak out the back door that is no longer being protected. He totally outsmarts the Romans, and they're getting more and more upset with Fabius delaying. So they appoint a new general, Rufus, as co-commander, and he thought he could take Hannibal down. So he convinces them to fight. He says, give me half the army, and he convinces Fabius to give him half the army, and he attacks Hannibal near the town of Geranium. And he's so badly defeated that Fabius has to come and save him. So again, advantage Hannibal, right? And then the most famous battle of all takes place when Hannibal marches on Canaan. And there's a capital, and we're talking about there, there is Capua, where he was trapped, and now he's going to march on Canaan. And the Romans send 2 consuls and the force of over 80,000 to fight him. And Hannibal has less than 50,000 under command, and as always, he has spent his time learning about the enemy. He's done his homework and his research. He knows their strengths and weaknesses, and he knew the Roman commander Myro. And you don't need to know the guy's name, but Hannibal did. And he was eager for a fight, and he was, and he felt like the Romans were, overconfident. And Hannibal knows that the Romans are, really kind of sick. They're mad people, and they're kind of tired of fighting, and they're over it, and they've been delayed and delayed. And he knows that they're going to try and be extremely aggressive, and he's going to use that against him. And so Hannibal arranges his army in a crescent, like a crescent moon shape. He basically outmaneuvers the Romans, and at the end of the day, the Romans are trapped, and they have this kind of sort of pride. They think that they're winning, that they have everything in hand, and they don't realize that they're marching headfirst into a trap. So the Carthaginian cavalry then closes the gap behind the Romans, and they're surrounded completely and massacred, basically. Well, not completely, but it's total humongous win for Carthage. Over half the Romans die, and Hannibal loses maybe like 6,000, but the Romans lose like 40,000. It's a devastating defeat for Rome, and I think you can safely say that the Battle of Canaan is one of Rome's greatest defeats during the Republican era, and it looks really bad for Rome. So, which is, you just kind of need to know that. It's on the, and then you have Croton over here, and it's on the coast, and he gets there and he cuts Rome off basically, and what's left for Rome after Hannibal kind of conquers all of this is he's already conquered the north, right? And all that's left is basically cutting off the south, and then he is basically going to write to the Carthaginians and say, hey, I've got Rome in their backyard. I'm here. I've defeated the army of the Romans, but I'm running low on supplies. I have allies, but I don't have supplies. I need a few more men and way more supplies. If you'll send it, I will finish them off once and for all. And the Carthaginian Senate says no. They said, no, you should be able to handle it with what you have. And it's a major turning point. Now the Romans catch wind of this, and they realize something is wrong here. Carthage is not interested in finishing this fight. And a young Scipio Africanus, who is the son of the older Scipio, he writes to the Roman Senate and says, hey, give me an army, and I'll take the fight to Carthage, just like Hannibal has been doing with us. He's only 24 years old at the time. He says, hey, let's go. He gets 10,000 troops, 1,000 cavalry to try and meet the Carthaginians head on. Initially, he fights in Spain and not Italy, and he's trying to defeat Hannibal's brother first. To make a long story short, the Roman Senate does not want to approve his tactic, but Scipio goes ahead and does it anyways. He ends up recruiting more troops. He finally ends up in Africa after a 2-year period from 204 to 202. Meanwhile, Hannibal is still undefeated. Like, they can't beat him. He continues to defeat the Romans over and over and over again in Italy. Even as Scipio is messing around with Spain, and Scipio has now landed in North Africa. And, at the Carthaginian Senate says to Hannibal at this point, hey, our bad, we messed up. Can you please come back and help us out before he gets here and conquers us? So Hannibal, he's like, hey, we could have defeated Rome probably for good, but you don't support me. And then Scipio is going to come land there, and now you want me to come back? And essentially, that's exactly what happens. And they've basically, the Carthaginian Senate ruined this great, mighty military man of Hannibal. And Scipio uses he studies Hannibal's tactics very carefully in the same way that Hannibal had already, taken pains to know the Romans and to outthink them. And Scipio is, kind of flipping the script. And he's seen this, and he's watched his father lose, for example. And he knows that what Hannibal is good at and what Hannibal is bad at. And at this point, you can imagine that Hannibal's confidence is pretty high, and so he thinks, hey, I'm going to go scatter the Romans easily with an elephant charge and all of this. But Scipio meets him at the Battle of Zama and actually defeats Hannibal using his front line as a screen for a very different kind of formation. Remember, everybody's used to, the Roman tactics of phalanx and tightly packed shield wall formation. Instead of doing that, Scipio presents a horizontal front across a thin line, and his troops, and he arranges his troops in a vertical rows. And so when Hannibal launches this elephant charge, Scipio's front line simply moves to the side, and the elephants run harmlessly down these alleyways between the Roman troops, and they kill the handlers, and then, eventually the elephants go into a panic and stampede, and they're pretty skittish despite their size, and he's able to turn the elephants against the Romans, against the Carthaginians, and they actually end up running back towards the Carthaginians and stampeding into them. And so Scipio definitely outsmarts Hannibal in this war. Now, after that, he's able to conquer Carthage from there. And so after the war, Hannibal eventually becomes a magistrate, and he flees to Syria before the Romans can capture him and end his life. He takes poison to allow him a noble death rather than to let the Romans capture him, who, of course, would have paraded him around and tortured him to show their superiority. And this is kind of the closest, again, that the Romans came to losing everything in a very crucial moment that could have really swung the fortunes of history. If the Carthaginian Senate had just supported Hannibal, we might be talking about a very different history of the world. But they didn't, and as we say, the rest is history. Rome wins this, Second Punic War, which is the big one, and then another one just to really kind of clean up everything else, the Third Punic War, which was really, like I said, a cleanup operation. But it's really important that we took some time with this so that you understand just how close Rome was and how great Hannibal's defeat of them was, and then what Scipio was able to do. And it's really, really important part of the history of the Roman Republic. And that's the end of this section.